November 8, 1972. The northern sky was a pale gray sheet stretched over an ocean of snow. The twin-engine bush plane, a small yellow de Havilland, trembled against the Arctic wind as it cut through the frozen silence of Canada's Northwest Territories. Inside, 4 passengers sat wrapped in parkas: a young nurse named Judy Hill, a 14-year-old Inuit boy named David Pisarayak Kutuk, a pregnant woman named Rita, and the pilot, Marten Hartwell, 47 years old, a man who'd flown over this desolate country hundreds of times. He thought he'd seen it all: whiteouts, blizzards, frozen lakes that looked like runways. But nothing prepared him for what was coming. That morning, the aircraft lifted off from Cambridge Bay, bound for Yellowknife, carrying a patient in need of emergency medical care. The radio crackled every few minutes with updates from nearby flights. But soon static swallowed every word. By the time Hartwell realized the storm was closing in, it was already too late. Snow turned to a solid wall. The horizon disappeared. The plane fought for stability, its wings slicing blindly through the white void. Hartwell glanced at his compass. It spun uselessly. Visibility dropped to 0. He tried to climb. The engines strained, whining under the wind. Then a sound no pilot ever forgets: the cough and choke of an engine losing power. Ice, it had built up on the wings and intake, starving the engines of air. The altimeter began to fall. Inside the cabin, Judy held the boy's hand and tried to stay calm. Rita prayed under her breath. Hartwell shouted something. No one heard. Then, out of the gray haze, a dark ridge appeared, rushing toward them faster than thought. The impact came like thunder. Metal screamed as the left wing sheared off against the frozen hillside. The fuselage tore open like paper. The world spun. And then there was only the sound of wind and the settling crunch of snow. When Marten Hartwell opened his eyes, he was upside down, strapped in his seat, the world deadly quiet. The smell of fuel filled the air, sharp and cold. He called out, "Nothing." The nurse didn't answer. The boy moaned weakly from somewhere behind him. Every breath burned his ribs. Outside, the Arctic lay endless and merciless. No movement, no sound, just miles of white stretching into infinity. He freed himself from the harness and crawled through the twisted wreckage. Blood froze on his gloves as he searched through snow and debris. Rita was gone, thrown clear, her body lying still under a thin drift. Judy was trapped, her leg crushed beneath the instrument panel. She didn't speak. She only stared at him, her lips turning blue. He tried to move the panel, but his strength was gone. Hours passed. The cold crept in. When he woke again, the sky was black. By dawn, Judy had stopped breathing. For a long time, Hartwell sat motionless beside her, listening to the wind hum through the torn fuselage. He knew the rules of survival: conserve energy, find shelter, signal for help. But at 40 below 0, rules meant little. What mattered was fire, food, and hope. And he had none of them. He tore pieces of insulation from the wreck to wrap around his legs. The boy, David, shivered violently beside him. He was only 14, but in that moment he was stronger than any of them. He gathered scraps of paper, bits of seat foam, anything that could burn. With a single match, one of only 3 they had, he coaxed a flame to life. It sputtered, then caught. For the first time since the crash, the cold retreated. They melted snow for water, using a metal cup from the galley. There was no food left, just the faint smell of smoke, and fuel. Hartwell's mind drifted in and out, replaying the crash, the faces, the screaming engine. He thought about the radio. Broken. The emergency beacon. Gone. The nearest settlement was hundreds of miles away. That night, they made a pact. They would survive until rescue came. Neither of them knew rescue might never come. By the 3rd day, the storm cleared. The Arctic sun hung low, casting blue light across the endless snowfields. Hartwell climbed a small ridge near the crash site. From up there, the wreck looked like a toy half buried in ice. No smoke trails, no distant sound of planes, just silence. He tried to light a signal fire, but the wind tore it apart. Down below, David was building something. A lean-to made from aircraft panels and seat cushions. He worked with a strange calm, like he'd done this before. Hartwell watched in disbelief. The boy moved methodically, his breath freezing in the air, his small hands red from the cold. When Hartwell returned to the shelter that evening, David had managed to seal most of it with snow blocks. Inside, the air was almost bearable. They sat together beside the smoldering fire, and for a moment it felt safe. But their hunger was turning to pain. By the 5th day, Hartwell could barely stand. He'd lost all feeling in his toes. His face was blistered with frostbite. David scavenged the wreck again and found a first aid kit. A few bandages, painkillers, a single chocolate bar. They split it in half. David smiled faintly as he handed the smaller piece to Hartwell. "You're the pilot," he said. "You need strength." That night Hartwell cried quietly when the boy slept. Days blurred together. The fire burned out and had to be rebuilt again and again. They used bits of the plane's insulation for fuel. The sound of cracking frost became normal, a heartbeat in the emptiness. On the 12th day, Hartwell woke to find his right foot swollen and purple. He had no feeling in it. Frostbite. He knew it was spreading fast. He tore a strip from his parka, tied it tight around his leg, and prayed it wouldn't reach the bone. David noticed, but said nothing. He only stoked the fire, melting snow in silence. When Hartwell asked him if he thought they'd be found, the boy didn't look up. "They'll come," he said, "but we have to stay alive first." That night, as the Arctic wind screamed through the wreckage, Marten Hartwell began to understand something terrifying. The boy wasn't just helping him survive. The boy was keeping him alive. November 20th, 1972. 12 days since the crash. The fire was dying again. The snow outside had swallowed most of the wreck, burying what once was an aircraft beneath a shifting tomb of ice. Each day began and ended the same way. Silence, smoke, and hunger. Hartwell had stopped trying to count hours. There was no point. The Arctic didn't measure time. It just waited. Inside the shelter, the temperature rarely rose above freezing. The aluminum walls creaked as if alive, flexing with the wind. David had lined the floor with seat cushions and used strips of insulation as bedding. It wasn't much, but it trapped enough warmth to keep them breathing. That morning, Hartwell tried to stand. Pain shot up his right leg like fire. His foot was black now, stiff as wood. He tore away the bandage and stared at the frost-bitten skin, lifeless, gray, and cracking. The smell was sickly sweet, faint, but impossible to ignore. He pressed his fingers against the dead flesh and felt nothing. He was rotting, slowly. David looked at him from across the fire. "You can't walk," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Hartwell didn't answer. He just stared at the snow through the hole in the fuselage. He knew what that meant. If rescue didn't come soon, he wasn't leaving this place. The boy spent the next hours scavenging. He went out into the wreckage, the wind biting at his face, and brought back whatever he could find. Scraps of fabric, wires, even the cracked glass from the cockpit window. He didn't say much when he returned, just nodded and started reinforcing the shelter again, sealing holes with snow and metal shards. Every movement was deliberate. Hartwell watched him with a strange mix of admiration and guilt. This child, half his size, half his age, had kept them alive when Hartwell himself could barely think straight. He remembered the calm way David had built the first fire, the way he talked about the land, about the elders who taught him to read the snow, to listen to the wind. The boy belonged here in a way Hartwell never could. But even David was weakening now. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken. He'd stopped talking about rescue. The fire burned lower each night, and the chocolate was long gone. Hartwell began to dream of food, roast beef, bread, even the bitter taste of coffee. He'd wake with his mouth dry and his stomach twisted into knots. On the 15th day, he thought he heard an engine. Faint, distant. He scrambled outside, screaming into the endless sky. But there was nothing, just the moan of wind across the ice. When he stumbled back into the shelter, David was sitting motionless, staring at the snow melting in the tin cup. "You didn't hear it," the boy said softly. Hartwell shook his head. "There's nothing out there." That night, the temperature dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. The cold was a living thing, creeping through the seams of the shelter. They huddled together near the embering fire. Hartwell couldn't sleep. He kept seeing faces, Judy, Rita, the wreckage spinning through the air. Every time he closed his eyes, he was falling again. Sometime after midnight, David whispered, "If I don't make it, you keep trying." Hartwell opened his eyes. "Don't talk like that." But the boy didn't stop. "If I don't make it, you promise you won't give up." Hartwell didn't answer. He didn't have the strength to lie. November 23rd. A pale sun struggled through the clouds, throwing long shadows across the snow. Hartwell crawled from the shelter, dragging his useless leg behind him. The wind had carved strange shapes into the drifts. Frozen waves, jagged and endless. Somewhere beneath that ice was Judy's body. He hadn't looked since the crash. Now he forced himself to. He dug with his bare hands until his knuckles split and bled. The cold didn't let him feel it. When he finally found her, she was still half trapped under the panel, her face frozen in a grimace of pain. He whispered an apology he wasn't sure she could hear. Something in him cracked that day. The hunger, the pain, the endless white, it all folded into one thought. He wouldn't survive another week. When he returned to the shelter, David was lying still, breathing shallowly. His lips were pale, his hands trembling. He hadn't eaten in days. Hartwell melted a cup of snow and held it to the boy's mouth, but he could barely swallow. "You have to eat," Joe Hartwell said. "There's nothing left," the boy whispered. The truth hung between them like smoke. There was only one thing in that wreck that could keep them alive: the frozen bodies of the dead. Hartwell tried not to think about it, but the thought dug in, growing sharper each day. By the 17th day, David couldn't stand. He lay curled near the fire, eyes glassy, his breath shallow. Hartwell sat beside him through the night, listening to the wind claw at the walls. He tried to pray, but no words came, just the sound of his stomach twisting, the echo of his heartbeat in his ears. When morning came, David didn't move. Hartwell shook him gently. "David?" Nothing. He pressed his ear to the boy's chest. Silence. The shelter felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. He sat there for hours, staring at the boy who'd saved his life. The cold didn't bother him anymore. Nothing did. That night, hunger became something else. Not pain, but confusion. A fog wrapping his thoughts. He couldn't think straight. He knew the body outside was frozen. He knew there was meat. He knew if he didn't eat soon, he'd join them. He didn't remember the moment he decided, only that his hands were shaking, and his tears froze before they reached his chin. The next day passed in silence. The fire burned bright again, but Hartwell couldn't look at it. Every bite was another step deeper into madness. He didn't know if he was alive anymore, just a body reacting to instinct. But the strange thing was, it worked. His strength returned slowly. He began to move again, to think again. The guilt was unbearable, but the animal part of him didn't care. He rebuilt the fire, patched the shelter, melted snow. Days passed, maybe weeks. He stopped counting. The sky never changed, always the same endless white. December 5th, 1972, 27 days since the crash. Hartwell lay inside the shelter, staring at the flickering shadows on the aluminum walls. The fire was small now, fed with the last bits of insulation. His foot was gone from infection. He'd cut away what he could to stop the rot. He didn't feel the pain anymore. Then he heard it. a sound he hadn't heard in almost a month. Engines. At first, he thought it was another hallucination. He crawled outside, blinking against the glare. And there it was, a faint speck moving across the horizon. A search plane. He waved a scrap of fabric, screaming, until his voice broke. The plane circled once, twice, and then banked away. It hadn't seen him. He fell to his knees, sobbing into the snow. When the sound finally faded, only silence remained. December 6, 1972. The Arctic dawn came slow and colorless. Hartwell hadn't slept since the search plane vanished beyond the horizon. His throat burned from screaming. His body felt hollow, like something inside him had already left. He crawled back into the shelter, the air heavy with smoke and regret. The silence was deafening. He stared at the frozen shell of the aircraft. Its yellow paint faded and cracked, its wings half buried in snow. Somewhere in that broken metal cage, 31 days of his life had disappeared. Each second stretched into eternity. He tried to remember the sound of a human voice. He couldn't. That night, he dreamed of cities. Cars honking, people laughing. The smell of food drifting through open windows. He saw his wife's face, his home, his hands clean and warm. Then the dream cracked, and the cold rushed in again. He woke up gasping, frost forming on his beard. The fire was almost out. He reached for more fuel. Nothing left but the seat cushions and pieces of Judy's torn jacket. He threw them in. The flames hissed and spat, lighting up the small metal room. He whispered to himself over and over, "Just one more day. Someone will come." But even he didn't believe it anymore. Outside, the Arctic moved like a living thing. The wind carved the snow into sharp ridges, and faint light shimmered off the ice. Hartwell watched it for hours, mesmerized. His mind was slipping. He knew it. There were moments he spoke aloud and expected David to answer. When silence came, it was unbearable. By the 29th day, he began to hallucinate. He saw figures in the snow, dark silhouettes moving toward him, waving. When he blinked, they were gone. He heard voices calling his name, soft, familiar, like echoes from another world. He didn't trust his mind anymore. Sometimes he thought about ending it, walking into the white, letting the cold take him quietly. But something primitive held him back. Maybe it was the promise he'd made to David. Maybe it was just the animal instinct to survive, even when the soul no longer wants to. He thought of David often now. The boy's voice still lingered in his mind. "If I don't make it, you keep trying." It was the only thing keeping him tethered. December 8th, 30 days since the crash. The cold was worse than ever. Hartwell couldn't feel his fingers. He moved slower, his body heavier. His lips were cracked, his face covered in frostbite. His breath came out in shallow bursts that hung in the air like smoke. He tried to stand outside the shelter, but fell almost immediately. His injured foot was a block of ice, the infection creeping up his leg. He dragged himself back inside and stared at the dying fire. It was over. He knew it. For a moment he felt peace, not relief, just stillness. The kind that comes when there's nothing left to fight for. He closed his eyes and waited for sleep to take him. But then, through the faint howl of wind, he heard something, a sound so soft it could have been a dream, a low hum, distant but real. Engines. He opened his eyes, crawled toward the opening, listened again. There, faint but growing louder. He dragged himself outside, clawing through the snow with frozen hands. His vision blurred. Above him, a small speck moved across the sky. It circled once, twice, then again. He waved his arms wildly, his voice a broken rasp. "Here! Here!" The plane dipped lower. He could see the dark belly, the gleam of the sun off its wings. He stumbled and fell to his knees, the tears freezing instantly on his cheeks. The search plane tilted again. Then the flare dropped. A streak of orange light burned across the white horizon, landing just beyond the ridge. They'd seen him. Hartwell collapsed face first into the snow. For the first time in a month, he smiled. Hours later, when the rescue team reached the site, they found what was left of the aircraft buried under a crust of ice. The team leader, a man named Jim Fraser, later said it was one of the most haunting scenes he'd ever witnessed. Inside the wreck, the air was stale and cold. A fire had burned itself to ash. In the corner, wrapped in a parka and covered with frost, was Marten Hartwell, alive, barely. He was incoherent, muttering about the boy, about the cold, about keeping the fire alive. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. He'd lost over 40 pounds. Frostbite had eaten through parts of his foot. His hands were swollen and cracked open from infection. When they lifted him onto the stretcher, he screamed, not from pain but from shock. The sunlight was too bright. The warmth of human touch felt foreign, almost wrong. As they carried him toward the rescue chopper, he whispered something to one of the men. "The boy saved me." They didn't understand until later. In the hospital days later, when he finally regained full consciousness, Hartwell told them everything: the crash, the deaths, the boy's courage, the impossible hunger, and the choice he'd made to stay alive. It horrified the public. Newspapers printed the story across the world. Pilot survives 31 days in Arctic, ate human flesh to stay alive. Reporters called him a hero. Others called him a monster. But Hartwell refused to defend himself. He just kept saying one thing: "If not for David, I would have been dead in a week." The boy had built the shelter, tended the fires, and rationed their supplies while Hartwell's injuries left him half-conscious. And when the cold finally took him, he'd done so without fear, leaving the man he'd just met 30 days earlier with the strength to endure. The inquiry that followed confirmed his account. Investigators found the wreck exactly as he'd described it: the frozen bodies, the fire pit, the shelter reinforced with metal panels. The medical examiner concluded Hartwell's survival was nothing short of miraculous. But there was something else. When asked what kept him alive during the darkest nights, he didn't talk about survival skills or training. He talked about faith, about hearing David's voice even after he died, whispering to keep the fire burning, to hold on. And maybe, in some way, that voice was real, because according to rescue logs, the search plane that finally spotted the wreck wasn't even supposed to fly that route that day. The crew had deviated slightly due to an unexpected wind current. A few hundred meters in another direction, and Hartwell's story would have ended in silence. In the months after, Hartwell returned to flying only once. He landed, stepped out of the cockpit, and never flew again. The Arctic had taken too much. He spent the rest of his life quietly, avoiding cameras, avoiding fame. But every year, on November 8th, he lit a single candle by his window for David Pisurayak Kutuk, the boy who saved a man's life in the heart of the coldest place on earth. And that small flame, flickering against the glass, was all that remained of 31 days of hell. A reminder that survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about hope. December 10, 1972. The rescue chopper lifted off the frozen tundra, carrying the only survivor from one of the most haunting crashes in Canadian aviation history. Marten Hartwell lay strapped to a stretcher, wrapped in blankets and oxygen tubes. Below him, the Arctic stretched endlessly, a silent kingdom of ice where 3 lives had ended and 1 had been reborn. As the helicopter blades thundered above him, Hartwell's mind wandered. Every vibration echoed through his fractured ribs, every sound reminding him of the crash. He kept seeing the boy's face. David, 14 years old, calm, brave, and far wiser than any adult should be. The boy who had lit every fire, built every wall, and whispered life into a dying man. He wanted to tell him they'd made it. But when he turned his head to the window, there was only the white horizon, empty and endless. By the time they reached Yellowknife, the story had already broken across Canada. The words "pilot found alive after 31 days" dominated every radio frequency. Newspapers rushed to print headlines before dawn. Reporters crowded hospital lobbies, demanding interviews. The world wanted a hero. But what they got was something darker. Doctors at Stanton Territorial Hospital were stunned by what they saw. Hartwell's right foot was nearly gone. Frostbite and gangrene had consumed much of the flesh. His skin was leathery and pale, his face gaunt, his teeth cracked from chewing frozen material. He was severely malnourished, weighing just over 110 pounds. But it wasn't his body that scared them, it was his eyes. They were distant, like he was still trapped out there, in that frozen silence. When nurses brought him food, he ate slowly, almost ritualistically, as if afraid the meal would disappear. He spoke little. When doctors pressed him about what had happened, he avoided eye contact. Then one night, a doctor named Robert Haynes sat quietly by his bed and asked a simple question. "What kept you alive?" Hartwell didn't answer right away. He just stared at the flickering light in the corner of the room and said softly, "A boy who didn't stop believing." The next day, when investigators from the Canadian Transport Safety Board arrived, they began piecing together the crash. The aircraft had gone down roughly 250 miles north of Yellowknife, in one of the most desolate regions of the Arctic. Hartwell's flight plan had taken him across a corridor notorious for unpredictable storms. They found the wreckage almost perfectly preserved in the cold. Fuselage cracked open like a rib cage, one wing torn off, and a small shelter built from its remains. Inside were burned seat frames, melted aluminum scraps, and the remains of a makeshift bed made from insulation foam. Investigators found food wrappers from the early days, then nothing. No provisions for over 3 weeks. That alone made survival almost impossible. But when they analyzed the scene further, they realized something chilling. The fire pit showed continuous use. Someone had kept that flame alive nearly every day for a month. It wasn't the pilot. His injuries would have made it impossible. It was the boy. The inquiry went public within days. Television anchors spoke in hushed tones as they recounted the ordeal. Some focused on the miraculous survival. Others fixated on the horror that followed, the act of cannibalism. Reporters circled the hospital, their microphones thrust toward anyone with answers. Did he really eat human flesh? Was it voluntary? Did he lose his mind? Hartwell refused every interview, but under legal obligation, he gave a full statement to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He described the crash, the injuries, the desperate struggle, and how the boy had eventually died. And yes, he admitted that after several days alone with no food, he'd resorted to eating small portions of the nurse's frozen remains to survive. The press called it barbaric. The public was divided, half sympathetic, half disgusted. But to those who understood survival, it wasn't a story of horror. It was a story of what happens when the line between human and animal disappears. Weeks passed. Hartwell underwent multiple surgeries to save what was left of his leg. The doctors amputated 2 toes and removed most of the infected tissue. He endured it quietly. No complaints, no tears, just silence. During recovery, he received a visitor, a quiet Inuit elder from Cambridge Bay, who had known David's family. The man sat by his bed for a long time without speaking. When he finally did, his voice was soft but steady. "You tell them what the boy did," he said. "Don't let them forget his name." Hartwell nodded. "I won't." When the investigation concluded in early 1973, the final report was brief but powerful. It listed pilot error compounded by severe weather as the primary cause of the crash. But beneath the technical language, the truth was clear. This was a story of impossible endurance. The report also made one recommendation, that northern flight routes should require more advanced emergency beacons and survival gear. It was quietly implemented later that year, saving countless lives in the decades to come. The inquiry ended. The reporters moved on, but Hartwell never did. For the rest of his life, he carried two things: guilt and gratitude. He told interviewers years later that every night he heard the sound of the fire crackling in his dreams, the boy's voice telling him to keep feeding it. That fire was his spirit, he said once. It kept burning long after he was gone. He didn't talk about the cannibalism again, not once. That part of the story doesn't belong to me, he told a journalist in 1985. It belongs to survival. When he eventually returned to Yellowknife years later, he visited David's family. They met him with silence. Not anger, not forgiveness, just understanding. In Inuit tradition, survival is sacred. The land takes who it takes. Hartwell brought with him a small gift, a compass. It was the same one he'd carried during the flight, the same one that had spun uselessly as the storm took them down. He placed it in the hands of David's younger brother and said, "Your brother guided me better than this ever did." The boy didn't speak, but he nodded. The story of Marten Hartwell became legend. It appeared in documentaries, newspapers, and survival manuals for decades. Some called it Canada's Andes flight disaster. Others called it the Arctic miracle. But beneath all the sensationalism, the truth remained hauntingly simple. Two people fought the cold for as long as humanly possible. One died keeping the other alive, and the man who survived never stopped hearing his voice. Years later, when Hartwell was in his 70s, a reporter visited him in his small cabin outside Edmonton. The reporter expected a haunted man, but instead found someone quiet, almost peaceful. On the wall above his fireplace hung a small framed photograph, a black and white image of a smiling Inuit boy beside a plane. When asked why he kept it, Hartwell said, "Because when the fire went out, he was the one who told me to light it again." Then he added something the reporter never printed, but later shared in private notes. People think survival is about strength, but strength dies fast. What really saves you is meaning. He gave me that. Winter, 1992. 20 years had passed since the crash, and the Arctic was still the same, a graveyard of wind and silence. A small group of researchers flying over the Northwest Territories spotted the remains of a wreck half buried in the snow. The yellow paint had long since faded, the fuselage cracked and scattered by time. They landed briefly, out of respect. There was little left to see, just a rusted frame and fragments of aluminum poking through the ice. But in the center of it all, still visible after 2 decades, were the blackened stones of a fire pit. It hadn't burned since 1972, but somehow it still told the story. In the years following the crash, Hartwell's name faded from headlines, but among bush pilots, trappers, and rescue crews, his story lived on, passed quietly from one winter to the next. It wasn't told as a tale of horror or glory, but as a lesson. Every pilot in the North heard the same line during training: "If Hartwell could last 31 days, you can last 3. It was both a challenge and a warning. Survival instructors studied the case, analyzing how a man with broken bones, frostbite, and starvation had endured the most unforgiving wilderness on Earth. They noted every decision, every mistake, every small victory. And yet every report came to the same conclusion. None of it made sense. Statistically, he shouldn't have lived. But Hartwell never claimed credit. In every rare interview he gave, he said the same words: "I didn't survive alone." He lived a quiet life afterward, working as a mechanic and flight instructor. He never remarried, never had children. But every November, without fail, he would drive north to a frozen lake outside of Yellowknife. There, he'd light a small fire on the ice. Nothing grand, just a handful of twigs and a few matches. He'd sit beside it in silence for hours, staring into the flames as the wind howled across the lake. When people asked him why he did it, he'd smile faintly and say, "Because someone once kept the fire alive for me." That ritual continued for decades. In 2001, long after Hartwell had passed, the government of Canada posthumously awarded David Pizarrayak Kutuk a Medal of Bravery, recognition that had come far too late. The citation read, "For courage and selflessness in extreme conditions, displaying remarkable endurance and devotion in the face of certain death." His story was added to Canadian history archives, studied in schools, and honored in Arctic communities. In Cambridge Bay, a small plaque was placed outside the town's medical center. It reads simply, "In memory of David Pizarrayak Kutuk, who lit the fire that never went out." For the people of the North, that was enough. Hartwell's later years were quiet but restless. Survivors of extreme trauma rarely find peace. He was known to take long walks into the woods, even in freezing temperatures, without telling anyone where he was going. Sometimes neighbors found him sitting on a log, just staring at the snow. He told a friend once that he didn't feel cold anymore, that after you've lived through 31 days of Arctic isolation, the chill never leaves you. It becomes part of your blood. He also said something else, something that stayed with those who heard it. Out there, you don't survive because you want to live. You survive because you don't want to die for nothing. That line would later appear in a documentary, the one that introduced his story to a new generation. It was called The Pilot and the Boy. The film blended archival photos, interviews, and haunting recreations of the crash site. Viewers were struck not by the gruesome details, but by the humanity, the relationship between two strangers who found purpose in the void. In one of the closing scenes, the narrator's voice fades over the image of a flickering campfire. When the cold took everything, food, warmth, hope, one boy built a flame, and that flame burned long enough to save a life, and maybe something more. The documentary ended not with tragedy but with silence, the kind of silence that makes you reflect on what you'd do in the same situation. And that's what made the story endure. Today, in survival training courses across the world, the case of Marten Hartwell is still taught. Not as a tale of cannibalism or despair, but as a psychological study in endurance, companionship, and the limits of human will. Experts point out something remarkable. The moment Hartwell was alone, his will to live nearly vanished. But when the boy was alive, when there was someone else to protect, he fought like a man possessed. That single shift explains more about human survival than any textbook ever could. When you have someone to live for, death loses its power. Modern survivors, whether from shipwrecks, plane crashes, or lost expeditions, often echo the same sentiment. The hardest part isn't hunger or cold. It's being forgotten. The Arctic doesn't kill with claws or teeth, it kills with silence. But in that silence, one boy's fire changed everything. Because somewhere in the frozen north, a tiny flame once defied the dark. And even after it died, its light traveled farther than anyone could have imagined. Closing narration, survivor tales tone. The Arctic doesn't forgive, it doesn't bargain, it doesn't care how strong you are. Out there, survival isn't about muscles or tools. It's about the quiet, stubborn will to keep breathing, even when the world has already written your obituary. On November 8, 1972, a small yellow plane disappeared into the storm, taking 4 souls into the heart of nowhere. Only one returned. He came back changed, broken, haunted, but alive. And when they asked him how he survived, he didn't talk about courage or skill or luck. He just said 5 words that summed up the whole story. The boy kept the fire. And maybe that's all survival really is, keeping the fire, even when everything else turns to ice.